Ghost at Dawn is a game that wears its inspirations on its sleeve while also finding a nice pocket of individuality as well. Coming from Blue and Red Games, Ghost at Dawn is $29.99 US dollars for roughly about 4 hours of playtime. A little more or a little less depending on your familiarity with the genre and your gameplay style. How's it going, everyone? My name is Falling Hurts, and if you like this video, consider checking out the game, consider subscribing. All of these things help me and, of course, developers as well. And that's the goal here. But overall, I'd like to jump over and say that I really like the game a lot. I have some small complaints that I'll get into in this review, but this isn't a death by a thousand cuts by any means. These complaints are more things I'd rather feel important that you know about going into the game, and you can kind of decide your point of entry based off of price, or if you want to get the game at all. That being said, let's go ahead and get right into my usual four categories: the story, the gameplay, the visuals, and the sound design. Starting with the story, I absolutely love the era piece that is post-World War II. I'm not a historian by any means, but the poignant inclusion of anti-Asian prejudice and the PTSD suffered from our protagonist, Detective Ben O'Hara, is a great catalyst to both the plot and, of course, the gameplay. The basic premise is that a young Asian girl, Emmy, was coming to America. When her sister tries to pick her up at the Pines Hotel, she's nowhere to be found. This prompts a call to Ben, where we break in at night to start our investigation. From there, you'll need to blast ghosts, solve puzzles, and manage your sanity to discover the fate of Emmy. No spoilers here, but I can genuinely say that I really like the way the story is paced. Upon first entering, you find plenty of notes detailing a few of the fringe storylines of some of the guests. Then, as you progress through the hotel, the plot unravels, and these notes end up as tasteful foreshadowing for the reveals to come. Reading notes won't give you the full picture, but the environmental storytelling on display in Ghost at Dawn sure does the trick. Most of the best ones, in my opinion, can't be shown due to spoilers, but whether it's a body found in a closet or something else entirely, just know that there's plenty of ways that the tone is delivered to the player. And speaking of tone itself, I will say that I think the game feels a little all over the place, but in a way that it almost feels weirdly coherent. On one hand, you've got a serious story to uncover what happened to Emmy, but on the other hand, you've got almost Borderlands-style splash screens heralding your victory over a boss fight. I guess that's what happens when you smoke 6 cigarettes, drink a flask of alcohol, and pop a bottle or two of pills within the span of like 3 hours. And with that oddly specific joke about the gameplay out of the way, I suppose we should move on to just that. Ghost at Dawn is a survival horror at the roots of the genre. Fixed camera angles, tank controls, or modern ones if you choose, and a limited inventory that feels fair but also very limiting are all at the core of the gameplay here. To me, it's best to just say that all of these work well, but this is where some of those small hitches do come in for me personally. Let me explain. First up, I'd like to mention that I love fixed camera angles. Ghost at Dawn is mostly no exception to this. There are a few times, however, that I think the game robs itself of spectacle. When I initially wrote up some of the notes for this review, I kind of mentioned that maybe it would have felt a bit unfair with these camera angles, but I don't think that's entirely true, and I think the sound design, hearing the ghost off to the side, definitely helps a bunch. But rather, I would like to focus on the fact that it does rob itself of some of the spectacle. See, moving from scene to scene usually results in loss of whatever visual you had previously had. Meaning there's times where enemies who were barely on screen before go completely off screen with the next scene transition. Mostly this is fine, and it really actually adds to the claustrophobic nature of the dark level design. Though there are a few specific instances where I think the fear could have been heightened if a single, wide view was given rather than a bunch of small ones pieced together. To anyone curious for an example of this without heavy spoilers, I would say the second floor hallway comes to mind. Another small issue I did have only really plagued me for about 5 minutes, and this was during the maze section. And it's where there's a change in perspective to more of the over-the-shoulder view, and there the controller sensitivity spikes. So I ended up switching to mouse and keyboard to go through easily, but otherwise I do recommend using controller for the game, as I had an instance where, while using mouse and keyboard, the game would auto-switch between the two control styles while moving from room to room, and that was really annoying. Though I wasn't able to replicate it, it only happened once, I just didn't feel like messing with it again. Now, with all of that out of the way, this is where I get to absolutely gush about the game and its gameplay. So to me, there's two major aspects of the game. There's the combat, and then of course the puzzles. Starting with the combat, there's a few weapons in the game, and they fit really well into that World War II era. And Ben, being a veteran struggling with PTSD, just adds to that whole layer of the story, in my opinion. It really does feel like there is a right tool for the job in certain instances. For example, certain rooms are plentiful with up-close ghosts, so ideally you'll want your rifle to quickly clear them up as it does more damage, but there's less ammo. The game's enemies, and you guessed it, ghosts, are really neat. You've got a few different types, and given the game's runtime, I think it makes sense for how many there actually are, so I'm not really too concerned with the gameplay variety here. There are boss fights in the game, and they're fine too. They add an extra layer to some of the areas, and they always feel really tense, as there is limited space to kind of go about them, and there's a lot going on at times, visually speaking. These fights are also paced quite evenly. In a potential sequel, what I would like to see is maybe a little bit more variety in these boss fights, but given the number and the pacing of it, I think it works out well. Another thing that I would like to see in the next game is that I would love to see some faster enemies just in general, though that would almost assuredly require health as a means for a failstate rather than just your mental sanity, seeing as how anytime a ghost touches you in the game, you instantly die. Now, as for health, you have none. Instead, the more time you spend in close proximity to the enemies or in the dark, the more unhinged you'll actually become. The screen will change and World War II imagery will flash quickly to show how far Ben has truly gone mentally. Funny enough, I noticed that depending on your mental state, certain item descriptions will change. Small details like this are what really made the game for me. To recover sanity, you can be a really cool guy and drink on the job, pop pills, and smoke cigarettes. And overall, I like this as a means of coping, both in-world and then also the fact that it's just, quite frankly, really cool. But I've talked a lot about different items, but in doing so, I need to talk about survival horror's greatest puzzle, and one of the best parts of Ghost at Dawn, the inventory. So straight up, you've got a very limited inventory space. Matches for light, a weapon, and some ammo are basic necessities, plus whatever important items you have that you need, such as keys, fuses, or anything else in between, and you'll find that you don't have much wiggle room for those puzzles. In comes the dumbwaiter, a centralized storage unit that moves floor to floor with you, and this provides the best example of a storage chest in a horror game that makes complete and total sense as to why it can be accessed wherever you are. I'm genuinely not lying when I say this is probably my favorite mechanic in the game, and not because of its use, but rather the way it just makes perfect sense, especially in the setting of the Pines Hotel. It's just awesome. And in talking about the inventory as a puzzle and everything, you've got key items that you have to figure out where they go. And honestly, the game is really simple in the sense of there is a locker at one point that you need to find the combination to, but rather than having to turn it and do everything on your own, you simply find a piece of paper that has the exact combination on it, and you just use that item there. And I think that works really well. There's also an instance where you have to think and use your brain to shoot out some glass to continue forward, something that's not really present throughout most of the game. And I would love more stuff like that, but I think the puzzles in this game, inventory-based, work really well. Now, I know I've talked a lot about the gameplay, but the final bit that I really wanted to say was that I love the Pines Hotel as a setting. Progression, being locked behind finding the right item to go to the right place, feels right, and the slow expansion of just how big the play area is feels so satisfying. Continuing on with that setting in mind, let's actually switch gears over to the visuals. It's no secret that the game is horror, but with anime sensibilities in the character design. Starting there, I really love seeing these characters with these, anime proportions in ghost form, horror form, all these different things like that. But don't let that fool you in thinking that it's all playful. There is dark imagery in this game, even though it doesn't force you to look at it all of the time. And I think the game's restraint in that is really commendable. Given a horror game, you could go too far with it, and I don't think that's done here. Otherwise, visually speaking, I really like the environments. I love the style of the visuals. I think it works really well. And having all of the mirrors actually show the reflections rather than being, broken or grayed out or something was also a really nice touch, and it makes the hotel feel omnipresent at all times. If I had to leverage any criticisms, visually speaking, I would say that I didn't really like the look of the particle effects, or whatever you want to call the smoke coming up from the candles or the matches as you use them. It just feels very loud as opposed to what's actually going on. But otherwise, visually speaking, I liked a lot of it. Small touches like when you shoot an enemy, these blue particles come off of them. That way, if you kill something off screen, you can usually tell and not waste any extra ammo, is really smart. And then speaking from a horror perspective, you've also got these little moments that you don't always have a jump scare, but you've got these moments like, say, the ghost in the window reflection, or the cat under the bed that you later find out what it is. these little moments like blink and you'll miss it reminds me very much of Haunting of Hill House, where the ghosts are just on screen and it's not calling attention to them, but they're there. Stuff like that to me is so, so cool. And visually speaking, I think Ghost at Dawn is a pretty much full success. There's no complaints that I have. I think visual variety from one floor to the next, room to room, all works really well. The leveraging of dark and light, the way PTSD shows up on screen, with the flashes, and even the imagery, I think works so, so well. And as I always say in my horror reviews, the visuals are only one part of the atmosphere. You've also got the audio. And finally, with the audio, I want to say that this game, I'm struggling with the audio of the game. I can't lie. I think all of the songs in it are really good, and they all have this tone setter. Some of those being, elevator music style touch to them where it feels like very at home in a hotel. And sometimes they're playing in certain scenes where, I don't know, it just doesn't make sense. I think sometimes it kills tension, even though I think the idea is more of a fake out or like that juxtaposition of lighthearted music with terrifying enemies. But there's no denying there comes a point where the enemies don't necessarily scare you anymore, at least not their initial presence. So when it comes to the sillier music, which isn't every room, and sometimes going from room to room is a complete difference as well, I think sometimes that does, clash a bit. Another moment where I feel like it clashes is actually the sound levels during a boss fight. You've got the clashing of like the music volume with the gunshots and everything, and it kind of leads to your gunshots tending to sound a little more quiet, even though the combat is the main idea of what's going on here. So there's a really weird mix there that I'm not really sure what the main, focus would be. But one thing that I absolutely must say is that when this game is working, sound design specifically, whether it be just gunshots in a quiet hallway, or certain songs within the soundtrack, or even the moans of the ghost that you're facing, or anything else in between, it can't be denied that Ghost at Dawn becomes a really, really well-toned and thought-out experience. And that's when I think the game is absolutely at its best. I think that there's just some sound kinks that I believe need worked out, but that's also up to my own taste as well. Now, with that being said, I want to kind of go into a little bit of a final verdict. Considering everything, sound issues at hand, but then also the really, really great gameplay design and the story that doesn't bore or even disappoint, in my opinion, with a really great visual styling that makes it very unique. I think that Ghost at Dawn at $29.99 US and for about 4 to 5 hours of playtime is really up to you in the sense of, is that a good price to hour ratio? Personally, I have no issue with something like that. So small issues aside, I think maybe whatever a launch discount would be a lot safer for a lot of people that don't like the shorter, like a $25 range. But if that doesn't bother you, I think that this game is really worth it. So with that being said, that's it for me. Thank you for watching. If you like the review, if you agree, consider subscribing. If you don't agree, please tell me why and then subscribe anyway. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.